Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show. It's Dobson and him, Tim Pan. Today we discuss, is technocracy inevitable? And is Caleb Maupin's innovationism possible? Tim.
Caleb Maupin apparently is no longer a Marxist, or at least no longer a dialectical materialist, and has found God. This story, whatever the precise details about his deconversion or whatever you want to say, is not particularly new. Burnham, the man who wrote Manager and Revolution and the Machiavellians, James Burnham, was a former Trotskyite. Christopher Hitchens and Peter Hitchens both started out as left-leaning people of some. I think Peter Hitchens was both of them were in Trotskyite type things, and then as later in life they became more quote unquote conservative. Christopher Hitchens, of course, supported the Iraq War and became a neocon. Peter Hitchens became some kind of Anglican conservative or something like that. But you can get rather into deep words about this reminds me of the debate about once saved, always saved. So like how Marxist was Maupin if he's no longer one. So that's like my first aside. I found this interesting that he's no longer. I think the dialectical materialism is an important aspect of Marxism, as I understand it. But I'm not a Marxist, even though I've said nice things about occasional things or lots. I think he has a good understanding of certain concepts and things, so forth. So one of the biggest reasons why I'm not one is I think humans have limits. Thomas Sowell would use the term restrained vision or constrained vision. This makes me almost reactionary in the sense that I don't believe in the utopian part. I don't believe in the man-made utopian part. And I think in practice, the goal of Marxism, if you go through all the derivations of their thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is a utopian, a contradiction-free society. Even if you believe evolution is the case, and you're a total naturalist, I just don't see how I don't see how you get there as humans, even with innovation. And which brings me to the topic of capitalism and Maupin as well. So capitalism. So Maupin was interviewed by Todd Lewis and Keith Preston, two people we've both had on the show, about his recent change about a month ago or so forth. And it was an interesting interview. And in the interview, Maupin accused capitalism of creating what he called abundance-created poverty. And he used the example, it's a common example of truck drivers, traffic cops, and courts, and Ubers/taxi drivers are going to be eliminated because of self-driving cars. Which is an interesting thing because on one hand, I've been looking at a lot of urbanist stuff lately, and you could argue that trucks destroyed trains and bicycles and pedestrians and horse-drawn carriages and so forth. So talk about destroying jobs. So the fact that there are truck drivers' jobs to begin with is only because there used to be other things that did that. Now, my other response to this would be, well, there used to be elevator doormen, used to be blacksmiths, and all sorts of things. And there also used to be coal mining. So a better example for my case and Maupin's case would be coal mining. Like in the past, coal mining used to be done under the ground with shovels and picks. But today, again, I'm not a Malthusian environmentalist. Please mind. I do think you should clean up your mines. But like in Germany, up until maybe 5 years ago, there's a good documentary on this, when the world's largest pieces of equipment mines coal. And I think about a few hundred people work on it. But it's just a giant piece of equipment that digs a giant pit, and it constantly runs and processes it. This lug type or whatever. It's a poor variety of coal, but they can use it. You don't need 1,000 people underground. Isn't that great? I would say that's great. So that would be like so he wants innovation, but innovation in practice is destroying jobs, and it does so in a Schumpeterian way. Joseph Schumpeter kind of create a kind of destruction of labor, not a worship of labor. And at core, I'd say Marxism, partly because of the labor theory of value, and partly because of the labor unions, worship laborers. like, I don't think it's a surprise that education looks exactly as it did when the Prussians set it up in the 1870s as it does now. And I think that's partly because of teacher unions and the state keeping education looking exactly like that. So, like, when he, to me, fetishizes truck drivers, like, I just think, well, if you really ask truck drivers, do they like their jobs? Many would actually say they hate their jobs and only doing it for the paycheck. Now, this gets into another question of, like, what do the people who have their jobs destroyed by the system do after that? And I don't have a good answer to that question. But innovationism, if that's what Maupin wants, seems to require destruction, and destruction is fueled by profit seeking, because firms or state affiliated firms are like trying to, like, well, if we got rid of the labor costs of truck driving, we could just save a lot of money, and that would reduce shipping costs. Wouldn't that be great? So that's like the core engine of, like, capitalism here, in my opinion, in my understanding of it. Yes, the state is always in it, and the state is always there, and the state's always regulating things. But I would say the regulations are oftentimes de-innovating or conservative. Now, that gets really tricky here, because you could argue that like this is where we get in accelerationist territory too. I mean, and as far as, and like, Maupin still wants a planned economy, which is fine. You could argue that all economies, including planned ones, including quote unquote air quote capitalist ones, are planned. But you have to sort of think about, well, compared to what? I mean, Nick Land was on an interview recently, and he said, people complain about, like, the David Graeber BS jobs line, but it's not like other systems don't have, like, it's not like the North Korean or other systems don't have BS jobs too. Like, all systems seem to have some amount of BS jobs. And you can get into what does the pure version of the system looks like and what's the non-pure version looks like. But if you want innovationism, you seem to have destructionism. If you want just, like, so my question is Caleb Maupin's society possible, for one, or what does he want? And is the end of the line just some kind of, like, AI technocratic dystopian, inhuman dystopian? Because it seems like most mainstream commentators around today are in a kind of doom and gloom mentality here, where we're gonna either get like it's either going to be the PayPal mafia or it's going to be the WEF mafia, and you can read Whitney Webb, or you can read, like, some of the anti-Elon Musk people on the left or the right, or you could just read, like, David Graeber or Mark Fisher. We have this inhuman future ahead of us here, or we're going to go back to hunter and gathering, and actually, or that hunter and gatherer was actually better than in modern industrial life. So that's my questions with it here. What does Caleb Maupin want? And is the future just this sort of, like, technological hellhole that is my description of this, of what mainstream commentators are sort of leaning into, largely right? So then, thanks for doing the show. And so,
I mean, at the heart of this, it seems to be, will the robots take over? Will you not have any jobs? Then the question arises, well, if there aren't any jobs, so what? It depends on the material standard of living of the people who don't have any. And the question is, well, how would you get them? So, I mean, that gets into lots of different questions. One in particular, whether if you want to make the distinction between soft and hard AI, whether hard AI would ever exist. If true, then I would agree you would probably have a problem where you get genuinely sort of rational robots, as it were. But if soft AI is just, well, they don't think, and sort of John Searle's Chinese room experiment is true with respect to computers, then there'll always be a tool, and it would just be a productivity enhancing tool, and well, at least, and then there may be massive destruction in the transition to probably what's best described as a cyborg future, whereby everybody has always got a sort of computer to enhance their productivity. So, for instance, in such a view, which I think is more likely, You're not going to have the end of graphic designers, for instance. Graphic designers just be substantially more productive, and there'll be fewer of them because the good ones would be able to do loads of stuff really easily and modify it and stuff with AI, with sort of AI image generators. And that's what they do currently. They send them to Photoshop and alter them as they see fit. So they're likely to continue. Now, granted, of course, it could get so good that anybody could be a graphic designer, to which the answer is question, I would say, well, so what? In that case. But with Maupin's position, I think the point I think is crucial with engaging with him is he seems to think that capitalism, quote unquote, or let's probably best describe it as the current economic dispensation to avoid any controversies over what the words mean, is that, if you did have self-driving cars, the truck driver, or self-driving trucks, the truck driver would lose his job. That would seem to be also the case in Maupin's position, because he wants innovationism. So it would seem that either what the state would do in Maupin's position would be either some sort of welfare until they can get retrained elsewhere, or there's this permanent sort of make work job scheme or something, whereby anybody who can't be gainfully employed in some like really useful manner will then be will then be reassigned elsewhere, and you'll have it sort of like in the Soviet Union, whereby nobody was unemployed because officially there couldn't be any unemployment in the Soviet Union because, well, it was the perfect economic system, and therefore there was no unemployment by definition. So I can only imagine under Maupin's position that you're going to need some sort of transitional fund so that the workers don't fear the loss of their jobs. But again, though, that ends up being a little bit sort of welfare capitalisty. Although, if it's the case you have state-run trucking companies with autonomous trucks, well, then of course it's a bit different. But that's the only thing I think he could have. You would need to have something like that, insofar as people aren't able to transition jobs instantly. And Maupin doesn't seem to be utopian, so I don't think he's going to go, oh yes, if we introduce communism, everyone's going to become Aristotle or some great individual. So I think that must be the only thing that Maupin would possibly envisage, although I've never heard him go in detail on it. And that is in principle possible. So I think that aspect of it, in the innovationism, but with like the safety net, is possible. But then if the innovation exists, the question then arises, well, will the innovation exist in such a position in society? To which the answer is, I think, highly unlikely, because to the extent that you have either state-run or you have heavy sort of central technocratic regulation, it prevents trial and error. And it seems to me that trial and error is the way that innovation takes place. We have an idea, we'll try it. And we'll try it, it fails. Oh, we'll try it again and see if it fails again. And then you just keep getting better and better and better. And to the extent that trying and failing is effectively illegal, it's going to retard innovation. And in this sort of state plan society, when you have the public ownership of the means of production, it's going to be very difficult for any sort of individual to be able to get resources to use unless you get clearance from the sort of state officials. Now, of course, in principle, Maupin might say, well, yes, we have this fund set aside. Yeah, okay, fine, maybe you could. But in practice, I mean, those funds are going to be allocated in a sort of probably in a capricious manner and some way. Any sort of internal sort of budgetary issue that you get in sort of current states. And to that extent, I'm expecting innovation to go down. Now, granted, he could come up with a model in which, at least in principle, it could work. You could get some innovation if trial and error is allowed and lots of people are able to do it. It just seems to be very much diametrically opposed to the idea of a centrally planned society to be able to do that. So there do seem to be some at least tensions when it comes to Maupin's thought, I would say, on that. But I think in principle, giving the truck driver a job after he ceases to be a truck driver, in principle, isn't something he couldn't do. That would be my brief overview of my position on Maupin's economic vision.
My question here would be, my next round of comments here is, where does innovation come from? And is Joseph Schumpeter right? Or is the version of Joseph Schumpeter that most people understand, or at least as I understand them, right in that economic quote unquote progress? And you can get into you can sort of debate, like you can get into these deep waters rather quickly over like what counts as progress. And I do think there's a big difference between like Amish farmers who choose or semi-choose to keep a distance, or people who go without phones for like a week, and actual like the Senegalese. Okay, I think there's a big difference between, or actual Russian peasants of the time, and so forth. I think there's a big difference between the two. I think choosing to be, to give up technology while everyone else, or only selective using it, and like I think you could call that lifestyle anarchism. But like I'm actually an advocate of that to some degree. But this goes back, like, where does innovation come from? Is it desirable? So if you think innovation is desirable, which Maupin, to his credit, does. He's not a Malthusian, and he's not an environmentalist, because environmentalism in practice favors the environment over humans, viewing humans as a kind of parasite. So the question for me is, where does it come from? And I would argue that to some extent, innovation is pathological in the sense that it's not pro-social. I think one of the reasons why you don't have that many quote-unquote women entrepreneurs is that because innovation requires a kind of rebellious or contra-social idea. Like getting rid of all the truck drivers is going to be, you are destroying the current as an existing dispensation. Getting rid of all the coal mines, which in practice, my area used to be a big coal mining area, but it was replaced by like natural gas and oil, which was cheaper and more efficient to get. Now there is the argument over energy security and sea routes and so forth, but natural gas doesn't require as much labor to get out of the ground as certain types of coal. Now I'm all in favor of coal if it's the quote unquote economically cheapest thing. But most coal mining that's done today is done in like Montana or in China. It's done in big open pits with huge Caterpillar or whatever, forget, there's other makers of these backhoe diggers and trucks like that. That's a very, technological type of mining system. It's not people breaking their backs with candles in mines. I mean, we should be glad that people don't have to go down and do that or sort coal by hand. So why did that happen? Well, I would say it happened because of the search for profits, which is considered a bad word. It's not out of the, this goes back to Adam Smith. And again, Adam Smith can be tagged as a Marxist, as Murray Rothbard has done. And he's also going to be tagged as a capitalist, of course. But this is sort of like and this goes back to the parable of the bees, which is something that a lot of commentators, it's private vice equals public virtue. So it's like you searching for a better deal, or the capitalist searching for a better deal in the long run produces better products. Now, obviously, the state interferes in the economy. Obviously, the leftists would say, "Oh well, the CIA and the has some sort of fund that funds all these capitalist corporates. They're only ostensibly capitalists anyway, so why not just make them state nationalized?" And did you know the Soviet Union also created a space shuttle program? And that's also true. It is true that Elon Musk and the PayPal mafia gets money from the state. But I think there's a difference between, I think there's a slight difference between getting money from the state and the state running the thing. I do think there is a difference between the two. Actually, I don't like the Supreme Court's decision about Twitter regarding the Twitter and COVID, but I do in principle think like there is some difference between having the state command you to do something and the state just outright running your business. So there is a bit of a difference there. So that'd be my claim. My claim is that the core capitalists, the core of innovation is a kind of almost vice, which is why I think a lot of Catholics in particular have a problem with capitalism because the core of capitalism is kind of like trying to find a better deal, so to speak. It's trucking and bartering and so forth. The guy who created DHL, which broke down the postal monopoly, I didn't realize this. What he figured out was ships. There was a lot of trade between Japan and the United States, but the permits would take forever to get there. So his idea was, well, they have commercial airlines. They cost about $1,000 a ticket, but I can hire a courier and just fill his bag with documents. That was how airmail as DHL international shipping started. The state monopolies never thought of this. This was the founder of DHL who did that. Like, that's a kind of like creative idea. Now you could say, well, that's just the kind of tech bro-y type thing, but you could also argue like the Jacquard loom was a kind of tech bro-y thing, or weaving, like what will all the weavers do, and what will all the local quilt makers do? And there's just hundreds of these small things that they get accumulated. That'd be my origin story for innovationism. Of course, the left has a sort of different origin. And the left libertarians also sometimes lead in the statist thing, saying that like the telephone was created by the military-industrial complex. And that is, that's vaguely true. But it takes a lot of work, like to convert the stuff to public use, like to convert public to make it civil use. It requires designers and people who are interested in the stuff, not just, to make stuff publicly, quote unquote, for civilian use, not just military use, requires designers and other things who have to have a motive. And I would say that motive is profit, or the mover of funds is profit. So if you want to call that inhuman, that's fine. But then that's where innovation comes from. That's my story. What would you make about my story about the origins of innovation as opposed to the left stories with it? Would you agree with it? Would you disagree? If so, where?
I think, now I'm no expert on innovation. I had always had in mind to read Matt Ridley's book on innovation, which I never got around to yet. But it seemed to me that there's various sort of aspects of innovation. So there was a good quote from Elon Musk saying, even if you have a working prototype of something, that's sort of like 1% of the task. What you need to be able to do is to be able to make that item at scale and reliably, and so that you can sort of produce it in sort of like a relatively cost-effective manner. I remember when OLED televisions came out, one of the reasons they were so expensive was that a lot of them that they made simply didn't work. The yield rate was comparatively, I think it was like 60 or 70%, like 25, 30% or so, just didn't work because of errors in the manufacturing process. So there's various parts of how you should break down innovation. And I think when you're getting to being able to innovate in putting an idea into practice, in most cases, yeah, I think that in practice is profit driven. When it comes in for the actual initial idea, then I think is probably a lot to do with nerds who are just interested in what they're doing and find something cool and interesting to do. And then somebody else goes, oh, this has a great commercial application. We'll just modify it and use it in that manner. That seems to be how it works. And the people who come up with the innovations, on the male-female thing, this is slightly different of a related. Ed Dutton wrote a book on genius, which I haven't read, but I remember him talking about it, saying the innovators in society, and I think this is all scientific as well, rather than just technological, are ones with outlier high IQ. And as you point out, moderate levels of disagreeableness, because they need to be able to challenge the status quo. So the actual innovators themselves generally, they're not necessarily massively antisocial, but they're hardly the most pro-social of individuals because they need to be somewhat disagreeable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to forge ahead with the new ideas. Now, then we get to the question of the government and funding and things. My understanding, say, with like the internet and GPS, I think it was created by the US military under various guises. But the actual application to civilian use did take a long time and was done by sort of private corporations. And I do think you're right with the distinction between kind of being told, a private sector organization being told what to do, than the government running it. There's clearly going to be a continuum problem. There's going to be a situation whereby they're told so much to do on a day-to-day basis that they effectively end up being a state-run organization, even if in name they're not. The reason I say that's a difference is because it seemed, I think the powers that be realized that properly nationalized organization and corporation simply didn't work very well. And that's why they went to the regulated private monopoly system, which they've basically gone on from since the 80s, since when the sort of the broad quote-unquote Keynesian consensus ended in about 1979 with Thatcher in England and Reagan in America. You go towards, largely sort of state-controlled capitalism, in essence. If you view sort of the Keynesian stuff between the post-war and 1979 as sort of the capitalist quote-unquote version of Stalinism, and then you revert to the new economic policy following sort of 1980. So you have these sort of, because you have the efficiency of the private sector, in theory at least, because there's profits and losses and stuff, which there aren't in the same way with government bureaucracies. So I think with innovation, we need to split it up into different areas. The last thing, is technology sociable? In a sense, the results can be. It depends what it is. I mean, you could argue that in certain respects, the telephone is sociable insofar as it allows you to talk to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to talk to. Although then that encourages people to live further away from each other and actually see people in person, and everything else being equal, that is more sociable. So there's social and non-social aspects. When it comes to jobs, I mean, if someone was knocking down trees with hand tools and then was given a better hand tool, then in a sense that's social, because, well, it's not antisocial insofar as the job system stays kind of the same. I think when you get to sort of industrial technology, primarily where the growth in productivity of anybody who has sort of a powered tool is so much greater than hand tools, and that's when you really start getting sort of the dislocation of jobs in the way that you hadn't had in the pre-industrial period. Now, granted, there were changes, clearly, but not nearly to the same extent or the same speed of development. So those would be my overall thoughts on how technology develops and whether or not it's social or otherwise.
One of the ways in which one reason I never was a Marxist is because of McIntyre. McIntyre wrote a book called After Virtue, and one of the claims he makes in his chapter, I believe it's titled Nietzsche versus Aristotle, but it's chapter dealing with Marx or Trotsky, and he makes the claim that, like, as soon as Marxists become pessimists, in a genuine sense, they cease to be Marxists. Because his core claim, McIntyre's claim, is that the core version of Marxism is an optimistic human endeavor, that humans can improve their environment to such level that we can get a contradiction-free society. That's an optimistic goal. Pessimistic Marxists, this is why I find Maupin's his turn to conservative Marxists to be not bemusing. That's a mean word to use. I actually think I like Maupin, his commentary and stuff. He's enjoyable to listen to. So that's, I don't mean this in the cruel sense, but I do think that Marxism is, of course, an optimistic belief in what humans can achieve. So there could be a case that no system works, that no system delivers. We're all just stuck with bad systems. We're all stuck with improper systems. I mean, like this gets into the Christianity part, where Christianity does view humans as fallen. Now, you don't have to believe. You can just stick to naturalist grounds. But even if you stick to naturalist grounds, I find that the Christian version of the story is at least sort of like diagonally true, in that if you believe that we're just, dust or specks of like some sort of positively charged void that created the just so universe and that out of soup life formed and then eventually we formed. The idea that you're going to get a contradiction-free society out of that, it's possible, but I just don't think that's very quote-unquote likely. And even the underpinnings of Marx, which are Hegel and Kant, like if you ask them, they're relying on a system of logic which many modern-day leftists wouldn't like, or the postmodernists would disagree with them. So like even their system to construct their kind of like dialectic materialist viewpoint is itself dodgy, to say on more sort of theoretical philosophical grounds. I'm just like, it could be that libertarianism just turns into tech dystopia or feudal or whatever. That could be the case. It could be the case that like the conservative Marxists say, well, I'd rather a Stalinist regime than that regime, because it's at least human. It's a human in charge, or labor unions in charge. But that's a kind of different debate than the debate that one is having regarding it. So that would be my basic problem with the sort of post-Marxists claim here. Because like if you're no longer optimistic about humans, then in a way you're no longer a Marxist. Because Karl Marx was a bit of a cheerleader for things that Maupin dislikes. Not just a bit of a cheerleader. I would argue he's an outright cheerleader. So like the U.S. acquisition of Texas or the British in India. So like the imperialism stuff, which Maupin opposes, as do I, although I probably oppose them for domestic reasons rather than foreign reasons. I'm not opposed to bringing up the foreign stuff, but like I think it's bad for the U.S. to have a standing army around, because it just will spy on my own phone calls, and it will come a SWAT team will come to my house, and the SWAT team is full of guys who learn their tricks from Israel and Saudi Arabia and so forth. Like that's why I oppose the U.S. military-industrial complex, not out of some white guilt or whatever, or some thing so forth. That's that's a good reason to oppose having a large military adventurism, or opposing that because why spend money on bombing and building up Iran or Syria or whatever? That doesn't seem very useful. I like Maupin's opposition to imperialism, but if you go back to Marx, and this is like the settlement of the U.S. Civil War too. Marx cheered the rise of Lincoln, and actually there was I think Tariq Alil, Chris Catron was talking about this. Tariq Alil said that he almost wishes. Actually, he did wish the Confederacy would win, because if the Confederacy won, there'd be no USA, and then decolonization would have happened in a much more straightforward way, rather than this sort of half-baked way it happened after World War II. I think that was his argument, because the U.S. is sort of like a halfway house between both sides of the revolution. But that's getting more adrift here. But I would just simply state that Maupin's limitedness, the limit, I would just stress the limits of the system. So even the critics of capitalism have to sort of like compare them to what? And that gets annoying, but like I do think that's a useful starting point. Like eyesight. Like if you want to say your eyesight's bad, if you're comparing it to like if you have death ray eyes, you just see through everything, and your eyesight's terrible. So I do wonder what the comparison point here. So Swetha, what do you make of my viewpoint on Maupin, as well as the general post-left milieu of like people become that? Now I'm glad they do that, but I do think they lose some of the strength of our analysis. What do you make about my comments about Marx and Lincoln and those things and the cheerleading of imperialism? And it is true that, and Maupin admits that, like class peace in Britain and class peace in Germany and class peace in the United States allows the United States to go out and bomb other places. It is true that Bernie Sanders supported this F-35 base in Vermont. The American Conservative reported that. It's one of my favorite stories out there. It's because they're good jobs. Servicing these F-35s are good jobs, and they're in Vermont. So that'd be my rejoinder to Caleb's post-Marxism. What would you say to those comments, Swithin?
The position on what was I going to say? The class peace at home allows imperialism abroad. It seems very similar to Hans Hopper's view that if you're relatively liberal at home and you're rich, it means you can afford to be aggressive overseas, which seems to be sort of a similar type of result of analysis, although the means of the analysis is somewhat different. And yeah, you're right with Marx and some of the socialists, the early ones that, they're very sort of pro-imperialism to get everybody away from backwards feudalism, which whether it was feudalism in the European sense, but it was certainly sort of tied to the land, sort of pre-industrial technology of societies around the world. The communists were in favor of breaking those up because Marx is very complimentary about the bourgeoisie of being able to usurp the landed aristocracy. It's just that it wasn't as good as the proletarian revolution, so it was kind of a way of getting it going. And that's very much the case. When it comes to the pessimism and optimism situation, I do think advocating a centrally planned society with massive state power, I do think rests on the idea that you can get good people in power who can wield it well, which does seem to me to be a somewhat optimistic view. And if you held a more pessimistic view on human nature, you might think, well, you know what, that's not a great idea. Let's have some sort of divide and control and quote unquote checks and balances, but I mean like proper ones rather than the fake ones that currently exist in the US at least, to be able to rein in a central authority. So I do think there's a problem. A problem with that, unless of course you become a left anarchist, and therefore that's fine. If you can be a pessimistic one, because you're going to be able to have these smaller positions, and so maybe you get kind of competition between labor unions rather than corporations or sort of petty bourgeoisie-owned firms or something. I mean, you could imagine a situation like that to some extent. Maybe that's something that Kevin Carson might endorse. But yeah, optimism very much, I think, ties in with heavy statism for the reasons I outlined.
What would you make of the commentary on regarding? So another core aspect of Maupin's thinking seems to be opposition to imperialism, and there's going to be two ways to oppose imperialism. One way is, well, empires are about control and domination, killing people. You can be various ethical systems can back this up. I mean, like the biggest opposition, of course, is Nietzsche regarding domination and power is good. But like you could just say, well, most ethicists and religious people say this is wrong, and you can debate over the details of this and so forth. But like you say, well, the U.S. invading Iraq or the British whatever, or Japanese or whatever, Russians, that's wrong, and we should impose it because it cuts down on human achievement. But the other way to do it is, as I stated, is to say that it's actually bad for the domestic population of the empire, the actual the core ethnic group that starts the empire. That it's bad for them. Now, what gets tricky is there might not be a quote unquote public good. Well, it's good for some people and it's bad for most of the others. That could be the real case here, the actual case here, but which I think is the case. But that's a different kind of different kind of methodology here than the sort of like anti-colonial discourse that Maupin definitely leans into. So that would be my. Now Maupin, to his credit, says he's an American patriot, and I don't like I actually don't like Maupin himself. I think he is quote unquote American patriot, but like I like the United States. I like the area where I'm from, and the people around them. Are they perfect? No. Are they annoying at times? Sure, but that's true of like anything. And this is where it gets into the nationalist discussion too. Like, I mean, like the paradox of a lot of like third world revolutionaries is basically what they achieve is a kind of nationalist protectionist regime which protects them from Western or they're also a non-Western, but like Japan and China now, even too. Japan did this up to the U.S. toppled them in World War II, but like it's to protect them from, you think about South Korea's rise. It's kind of like a protectionist capitalist bureaucracy that protects itself. The same way with Cuba today and so forth. You could argue that Cuba is nicer than certain parts of Latin America because of the Castro regime keeps the Western megacorps out and so forth. So like Maupin can oppose that, but he's sort of doing so on much shakier foundation than sort of like the American conservative who's opposing this on domestic grounds, which are more quote unquote real than the sort of more abstract grounds in which wars are opposed on other grounds. Like interesting discussion regarding the Vietnam War memorial, I think, is pertinent here. One of the things that some people on the left got annoyed about the Vietnam War memorial in the United States and DC is it only has the troops' names on them. It doesn't have all the names that were killed by, that the U.S. killed in Cambodia, let alone Vietnam and so forth. And it's like, well, you could argue that the biggest effect that the Vietnam War had was on America was the killing of the troops and the taxes and the militarization of society. That's the big effect on the domestic society. The third world at the time, it was just sort of like, a jungle far away. It wasn't quote unquote relevant. And that shows up in other wars that Western states do too. So that would be my opposition to I agree with much of Maupin's commentary regarding these states, but many of these states he's talking about them aren't socialist. They're just nationalist, protectionist regimes that want their own capitalist bourgeoisie too. Now you can debate over which is the best method to create that, and so forth. Is the South Korean or the Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore better, or is like Libya, or like what's the best method to get this kind of like metropolitan society? But your goal is to be sort of like a France or like a United States. Obviously, won't have the empire, but that's their goal. So it's still innovation, their goal. That's my little final line of comments regarding Maupin. If you want to add anything more to that, please do or please don't. But I just found the transition from Marxism to non-Marxism, while also retaining much of the sort of conservative welfare state, to be just kind of odd. His anti-war and anti-imperialism commentary is great. I just think that he's going to get into trickier grounds now that he's sort of left the, beatific vision of some of the Marxists that they have, and I do think they have that. That would be my comments regarding that, Swithin. Thanks for doing this episode.
What grounds do you think he would need to defend his anti-imperialist stance on? It seems to me that he could just do it on a sort of vague sort of Christian notion that, there's different nations and they should sort of rule themselves, on that kind of independence one. And so could be sort of similar to the black nationalist supporting the white nationalist because they both want their own separate thing and want to be left alone. That would seem to be a way that you could, unless I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, that would seem to be a relatively simple way of defending it.
it gets into what Keith Preston would call third positionism, which is, I would say, a nice way to say National Socialism. And there's a naughty word that you could go there. So, like, if you describe what he's describing, this is where he has a sort of problem he has to sort of answer or oppose regarding like who the state is for and who it isn't for. So that'd be my like quick response. Which again, I'm ambiguous on this topic, but like the third positionism stuff. That's where to me he has a question to make regarding like his sort of like ethical, moral, like foundings. Like the J.D. Vance, for example, was, he had different spheres of influence. Like people on Twitter were saying, well, Jesus helps the poor. Well, you could argue that like you could take this sort of Mennonite Quaker peace church position regarding Christianity, but like the question is like, if you're in a position of power like J.D. Vance, or want to describe it, and you're a Catholic, like you have a lot more work to do or not to do, and then there's a whole 1,000 issues regarding that. So I would just say when he left Marxism and found God, now he's into sort of a whole new house of debates and so forth. I mean, I sort of went through the same thing when I started learning and reading about Christianity too. So I'm not saying he isn't. I just remain ethically, like modern people have an allergy to a certain thing. Interesting enough, in the third world, the regimes that Maupin praises, if they were done in the first world, he would oppose them, and that would be my thinking. I think you actually agree with me, but that would be my overview here of why like he's going to have problems going forward. That'd be my position.
Oh yes, so I understand what you mean now. So yes, even though he doesn't like to describe it, he is sort of espousing what you could effectively call theoretical fascism, or if you want to be a little bit more coy with the terms, national syndicalism. That very much seems to be his position. He seems to take the view that that fascism necessarily was about remilitarizing of the economy. In practice, that may well have been the case, but in theory, that wasn't. I remember Ricky Moore sending me a long article saying about how the biggest influence on sort of theoretical fascism was the anarcho-syndicalist George Sorel, who actually ended up being effectively a national syndicalist afterwards. It seemed that the Italian fascists were sort of influenced by sort of Nietzsche and sort of anarcho-syndicalism, and then ended up being national syndicalists in every sort of corporate society. And that seems very much what Caleb is supporting, even though he doesn't like the terms and because he likes the historical baggage, but that seems very much what he's supporting, which effectively is very similar to what Rick Story seems to defend. And you are also correct, all these sort of overseas Marxist regimes, they're just national socialist regimes. I mean, none of them are, I mean, it goes back to Stalin. I mean, capitalism in one country, socialism in one country. I mean, like, what is that other than national socialism? I mean, it clearly is. Now, does it need to be that form of national socialism? No, of course, it doesn't need to be that particular brand. But the idea that you have the state-run society in the interest of the people, and it's not the people of the world, it's not a class, it's an ethnic group, then yeah, sure. I mean, that's clearly what he's doing. And in practice, all socialist states have always been national socialist states. Using the term socialist in a broad sense, public ownership of the means of production, yeah, they've always been that, but they've been run in the interest of the ethnic group. So Maupin would, as I said, I think would have to kind of use my sort of black and white nationalist analogy, have to go that way. But of course, then that looks bad because that looks like he's sort of quote unquote tribalist rather than a classist. And that's verboten in many circles. And he does seem to be I don't know what his position on immigration is. I'm not sure about that. But certainly in the American context, to be very much in favor of, seemingly very much favor of integration rather than segregation. And when I say segregation, I mean even voluntary segregation. I don't mean that that when he opposes segregation, he just opposes state laws separating whites and blacks. I mean, that I think he might think it's a moral wrong, for instance, that say a private school has like a 99% white intake, even though they're in an area where it's like 30% black. I get that impression. I could well be wrong, but the way he conducts himself, I think that likely. So yeah, you very much do need to. I think if he ends up where he needs to for his economic position, I think he needs a bit of a dose of, well, if not race realism, but some sort of broader ethnic cultural nationalism, for want of a better phrase, to sort of justify the positions and that kind of self-determination based on a sort of ethnic or national sentiment, which clearly is opposed to sort of theoretical universal socialism. So yeah, I'm guessing that's what you were thinking, if I understand you correctly.
The position, I think, is your description to me is accurate, in almost entirely accurate. If Gaddafi ran as a president of the United States, he would not be running under the current existing Democratic Party, or he'd not be running under the current existing Labour Party in the UK. If he was running as a white guy, now he might be able to run as an off-white guy but he would not. He would be considered the F word. That's the problem to me that Maupin has, and the problems he will get into, and that's why I find the whole thing. And the more I think about it, the more clearer my thoughts on the issue are going. I remain something of an anarchist, partly out of the limitations here. So that's my own view of it. It could be you could call it a silly position, but that's my own rough view on what Maupin's conservative socialism would be. Thanks for doing the show.
No problem. I think that was helpful. I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you'd like this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.